The Boy and the Drum. It was a quiet evening in the village of Kwaku, the kind of evening where the sun dipped low and the shadows stretched long across the land. We had all gathered around the fire, the elders telling stories of the old days, the days before the world became so fast and restless. It was during one of those evenings that we first heard about the boy and the drum. Kofi was a curious boy, always wandering off into the woods, asking questions about everything. He was the youngest son of Nana Kwame, a respected elder in our village, and like his father, Kofi was known for his courage. But no one could have known that his curiosity would lead him to something that would change our village forever. One day, Kofi went deeper into the forest than he had ever gone before. He was chasing a butterfly, or so he said. The elders warned him not to stray too far, for the forest was full of strange things that should be left alone. But Kofi, with his bright eyes and adventurous spirit, did not listen. It was late in the afternoon when he returned, carrying something strange under his arm. It was a drum, but not like any drum we had ever seen. The drum was made of dark wood, and its skin shimmered as if it were alive. The carvings on its sides were intricate, twisting in patterns that seemed to change when you weren't looking directly at them. The moment Kofi laid it on the ground, we all felt it, a chill in the air, a heaviness that made the evening seem darker than it was. "Where did you find this, Kofi?" asked my father, old Juma, the village chief. He had seen many things in his life, but even he looked uneasy as he stared at the drum. "I found it deep in the forest," Kofi said, his voice trembling a little. "It was just lying there, as if it was waiting for me." The villagers gathered around, their faces filled with curiosity and concern. We had all heard the stories of mystical things hidden in the forest, things that could grant power, but at a terrible cost. The elders warned Kofi not to touch the drum, but it was too late. Kofi had already begun to play it. At first, the sound was beautiful. The drum sang a deep, soothing tune, its rhythm carrying through the air like the heartbeat of the earth itself. It was unlike any music we had ever heard. It was as if the forest itself was responding, the trees swaying to the beat, the animals pausing to listen. But then something strange happened. Kofi's face changed, his eyes widened, and his body began to tremble. The beat of the drum grew faster, louder, until it was all we could hear. The villagers stepped back, fear creeping into their hearts. Kofi's hands slapped the drum faster and faster, his breath coming in short gasps. He looked as if he was no longer in control. "Stop! Kofi, stop!" my father shouted, but Kofi didn't hear him. His eyes were glazed over, his whole body shaking. Then Kofi collapsed. We rushed to his side, lifting him up. His body was cold, and his face was pale. He opened his eyes slowly, but he looked different. His eyes had lost their spark, as if the life had been drained from him. "What happened?" I asked, my voice shaking. "I don't know," Kofi whispered, his voice weak. "The drum, it took something from me." We carried him home, but that was only the beginning. Over the next few days, Kofi became weaker and weaker. Every time he tried to play the drum, the same thing happened. The life in him seemed to drain away, leaving him pale and exhausted. The villagers started to notice it too. They said that every time the drum was played, something dark and heavy settled over the village, like a storm waiting to break. One evening, Kofi came to my father, his face twisted with fear. "I can't stop it, Chief Juma. The drum won't let me go. Every time I play it, it takes something more from me. But I can't leave it. It calls to me." My father's face grew dark. "You must stop, Kofi. The drum is cursed. It has been waiting for someone like you, someone with enough courage to touch it. But it will drain you, boy. It will take everything you have. I don't know what to do," Kofi whispered, his voice barely audible. "I thought it would bring me power, but it's killing me." That night, we heard strange sounds from the forest. The animals were restless, and the wind howled through the trees as if it were speaking. Some said they saw shadows moving between the trees, figures that weren't quite human. The villagers were afraid to sleep, and many stayed up by their fires, watching the darkness. The next morning, Kofi was gone. We searched the village, calling his name, but he was nowhere to be found. The drum, however, was still there, sitting in the middle of the square, as if waiting for someone to play it again. We didn't know what had happened to Kofi. Some said the drum had taken him, that it had claimed him as its own. Others believed that Kofi had run off, too afraid to face what he had started. But one thing was certain: the village was never the same after that day. We still hear the drum sometimes. In the middle of the night, when the wind is quiet and the moon is full, you can hear the faintest sound of drumming in the distance. Some say it's Kofi, playing the drum deep in the forest, forever bound to its magic. Others say it's the drum calling to someone else, waiting for the next person to pick it up, to feel its power, and to pay its price. But none of us dare to go near it. We've learned that some things in this world are better left alone, and so the drum waits. The return of Kofi and the drum. 5 years had passed since Kofi had disappeared. The village of Kwaku had slowly healed from the strange events surrounding the mystical drum. Life had returned to a peaceful rhythm, but the shadow of Kofi's disappearance lingered in the hearts of the villagers. His name was still whispered in the wind, and the drum that had caused so much pain and fear lay forgotten, hidden away in the corner of the village square. But peace was never meant to last. The neighboring village, led by the wicked king Asare, had always coveted the fertile land of Kwaku. For years, there had been tension, whispers of war. King Asare was a greedy ruler, known for his cruelty and desire for more land, more power. His armies were large, and he had been biding his time, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. That moment came one fateful morning. The villagers were going about their day when the sound of war drums echoed through the hills. The earth trembled beneath their feet, and the air grew thick with fear. The soldiers of King Asare were marching toward Kwaku, ready to claim it for themselves. We knew this day would come. Old Juma, the village chief, said with a heavy heart. The king has grown bold. He will not stop until he has everything. The villagers gathered in the square, fear in their eyes. They had no army, no weapons to defend themselves. But just as despair began to settle over them, a familiar figure appeared on the horizon. It was Kofi. He was no longer the young boy who had disappeared into the forest. He had grown taller, his face marked with the wisdom of someone who had seen things no one should see. His once bright eyes were now dark, filled with the weight of the drum's power. And in his hands, he carried it, the mystical drum. The villagers gasped as he walked toward them, the sound of the drum tapping softly against his side. Kofi had returned, but something was different about him. He looked tired, as if the drum had taken more from him than ever before. But there was no time to ask questions. The enemy was coming. Kofi, my father called, rushing to him. Where have you been? The village is under attack. Kofi looked at him with a solemn expression. I know, Chief Juma. I've seen them coming. The drum called to me, and I had no choice but to return. The drum? I asked, my voice trembling. But Kofi, it drains you. It took everything from you before. You can't play it again. Kofi's eyes were distant, as if he could hear the drum calling to him even now. I have no choice. The drum is the only thing that can protect us. Every time they attack, I will play it, and each time, something will happen. The villagers were afraid, but they trusted Kofi. He had saved them once before, and now they hoped that he could do it again. As the sound of war drums grew louder, Kofi raised the mystical drum high above his head. The sky seemed to darken, and the air grew thick with tension. The villagers stood back, watching in awe and fear as Kofi struck the drum. The first beat was soft, but it echoed through the village like a distant thunderclap. The ground trembled beneath their feet, and a low, rumbling sound filled the air. Kofi's hands moved faster, the rhythm growing louder, more urgent. The drum's power surged through him, and the villagers could see it. The magic was returning. From the forest came the first sign. The trees began to move. They twisted and bent, their branches stretching toward the village like long, gnarled fingers. The earth shook again, and suddenly the ground opened up. From the cracks in the earth, massive roots emerged, twisting and growing, forming a wall of vines and thorns. The invaders, who had been marching toward the village, stopped in their tracks, confused and terrified. "Look," someone shouted. "The forest is fighting back." The soldiers of King Asare hesitated, their eyes wide with fear. But their king's orders were clear. "Advance," he shouted. "Do not let the magic fool you." The soldiers charged forward, but as they did, something even more terrifying happened. The animals of the forest, lions, elephants, and buffalo, emerged from the trees, their eyes glowing with an unnatural light. The earth itself seemed to come alive, the animals moving as if they were controlled by the very heartbeat of the land. Kofi continued to play the drum, his hands moving faster now, his body trembling with the effort. The animals charged toward the invaders, their power overwhelming. The soldiers fought back, but they were no match for the strength of the forest creatures. The lions tore through their ranks, the elephants trampled their weapons, and the buffalo sent men flying through the air. The invaders panicked, retreating into the forest, but the animals followed, chasing them down with relentless fury. The battle was over in minutes. The village of Kwaku stood victorious, but Kofi was on his knees, exhausted. His face was pale, and his hands shook as he lowered the drum. The magic had drained him, just as it had before. He had given everything once again to protect the village. The villagers rushed to his side, helping him to his feet. "Kofi, you did it!" They cheered, their voices filled with gratitude. But Kofi's eyes were hollow. "I did what I had to," he whispered. "But the drum, it takes too much. I don't know how many more times I can play it." My father, old Juma, placed a hand on Kofi's shoulder. "You've done more than anyone could ask, Kofi. But you must rest now. The village is safe." Kofi nodded weakly, but he knew deep down that the peace would not last forever. King Asare would return, and when he did, the drum would call to him again. Kofi had no choice but to answer. As the villagers celebrated their victory, Kofi sat alone by the fire, staring at the drum in his hands. The magic was powerful, but it came at a terrible cost. He wondered how much more he could give before the drum took everything from him. But for now, the village was safe. For now. The days following the battle were filled with celebration, but Kofi remained distant. The villagers tried to lift his spirits, but he knew the truth. The drum's power was a heavy burden, and the price he paid was more than his body could endure. He had given everything to protect the village, but the drum had taken a piece of him each time. As the seasons passed, Kofi grew weaker. His once strong hands trembled constantly, and his eyes, once filled with determination, were now clouded with exhaustion. The villagers tried to offer help, but there was nothing they could do. The drum had drained him of his strength, and the magic that had once protected them now consumed him from the inside out. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Kofi sat alone by the fire, his fingers gently tapping on the drum. The village was quiet, the air thick with the weight of unspoken words. His father, old Juma, approached him, his steps slow and deliberate. "Kofi," he said softly, placing a hand on his son's shoulder. "You've done enough. The village is safe. It's time to rest." Kofi looked up at his father, his face pale and gaunt. "I can't rest, father. The drum, it won't let me. I must protect the village, even if it means giving everything." Old Juma's heart ached. He had seen the toll the drum had taken on his son, and he knew that Kofi could not go on much longer. "I wish I could carry the burden for you," old Juma whispered, his voice breaking. Kofi smiled faintly, but it was a smile filled with sadness. "You have carried it for me, father. The village is safe because of you too." As the night grew darker, Kofi's breathing grew shallow. He continued to tap the drum, each beat slower than the last. The magic within it stirred one final time, but it was a magic that Kofi could no longer control. With one last, sorrowful beat, the drum's power surged through him, and Kofi collapsed to the ground. The drum fell from his hands, its sound fading into the silence of the night. The villagers rushed to his side, but it was too late. Kofi had given everything. The drum had taken him, body and soul. The village mourned for days, their hearts heavy with grief. But even in their sorrow, They knew that Kofi's sacrifice had saved them all. The drum was placed in the center of the village square, a silent monument to the boy who had become a hero. Years passed, and the memory of Kofi never faded. The village of Kwaku continued to thrive, but they never forgot the boy who had given his life to protect them. Every year, on the anniversary of the battle, the villagers would gather around the drum, remembering Kofi's bravery and the cost of his sacrifice. And so, Kofi's name lived on, not just in the whispers of the wind, but in the hearts of the people. The village of Kwaku would never forget the boy who had returned to save them, and the drum that had taken everything he had to give. For Kofi, the drum had been both a gift and a curse. But in the end, it was his love for his people that had triumphed. The village was safe, and though Kofi was gone, his spirit would forever live on in the land he had protected, in the stories that would be told for generations to come. And so, the drum remained, a reminder of the price of peace, and the boy who had paid it. Don't forget to like this video, and subscribe to the channel for more amazing content.